I wanted to ask you a little bit about the tariffs. So the Supreme Court came down after our episode on Friday and said, yeah, Trump, you can't do that. That's illegal. And so
Right.
like, okay, huge win. And then Trump goes around and says, well, let's do 10% tariffs on the whole world. That's my result. Actually, let's bump it up the next day to 15%. I'm doubling
Right.
down. So what is this? How can we do that?
Okay.
Who's it?
Well, yeah. Okay. They didn't strike down all of his tariffs, but most of them. There were specific. He's authorized. Congress has authorized the president to impose tariffs under certain circumstances. And they said that this authorization that he used to impose, most of the tariffs that he has on the world is not valid. Um, it was a 6-3 decision. So he was, Trump was furious. So he immediately, like you said, he slapped a 10 and then 15% tariff on the whole world, in addition to any other tariffs that may be in effect that are still valid in those countries. But this is under a kind of temporary emergency authorization that was that is limited to, I think, 150 days. So these 10 to 15% tariffs will be in effect for 150 days, and then they can expire unless I think Congress chooses to extend them. So that's where we are right now.
Okay. I mean, is there a chance that he's going to have to pay back all this money that
Yeah,
collected?
okay, right. That's my understanding. I don't, that was left a little bit ambiguous. I'm not quite sure, but I think, again, because they were imposed, without valid authority, and therefore, according to law, and it's just common sense, that needs to be refunded. And that's what I've heard from different sources. And so we're talking about, I think, at least $80 billion. So that's quite a blow to Trump. And he's furious about it. There's no question about it. But that does show that there, like I said, I think there's some integrity in the system. There's some, it really was an abuse of executive authority. It always looked to me that way. And so he has been reined in, at least slightly, and he doesn't like it. Another place where he's reined in was recently he went after some Democratic congressman who said that, you generals, you have a right to reject illegal orders, which I think is just a statement of fact. They do, if they're truly illegal, they do have a right. And he said that, essentially these people are traitors, and he even implied, or maybe he said it explicitly, they should be executed. I mean, it was really quite an extreme statement. And then he sicked the prosecutors on them, and the DOJ, and they went after him. They actually brought indictments. The DOJ did against these Congress people, and but it was put before a grand jury, and the grand jury shot it down, which is actually pretty unusual. Grand juries generally rubber stamp things. They generally just whatever. They're much too compliant, with authority. But they shot it down. So, I mean, that's another example where we have to admit, the system is held up, because that's what we're supposed to have in our system, these checks and balances. And so we'll see.
What I'm afraid of is that the integrity of parts of our system might actually cause a divide, because then you have multiple points of authority, and then this causes some type of split. Like if Trump just says, no, I'm not listening to the Supreme Court. We're not doing this. Right. Like, I am in charge. This is the executive holds the power. And then other people would say, well, actually, no, the Supreme Court said you don't. So I'm going with them. And then other people are like, no, you got it. Like, isn't this a potential problem?
Yeah, that is. Actually, it's just been, it really depends, again, when it comes down to, you have a constitution, you have a republic on paper, with our system of checks and balances, but it does actually depend on all the actors. In the end, you can have something on paper, but it's just that people have to abide by that system, and say, okay, well, accept this, the executive does have to accept the authority of the courts. And we've already seen some signs that, that Trump doesn't. In fact, I think the Trump administration has just disregarded some of the rulings that judges made regarding, some of these detainees, that were seized by ICE and then just sent overseas to El Salvador or wherever. I say, well, wait a second. I had already, this person was was playing by the rules. He was in the country. Actually, he was due for a court appearance, and now you just grabbed him. You can't do that. And essentially, the Trump administration responded with a big "fu." These are smaller issues, but it's still real, and it shows that there is a real impatience with judicial authority. And again, Trump showed that he was furious about this, about the Supreme Court decision, and implied, that these, the justices were just bums, and they were idiots for doing this. And he used, very language that's really generally we have not seen before. It's just like there has been a code of conduct. It's just like you might, as a politician, be very angry about a decision, which might have a right to be angry. Let's not say that like the judges are always right. They certainly aren't, but that's a system. And so when the judge makes a decision, you accept it, and you do restrain your language. You say, I disagree, we're going to file an appeal or whatever, but you don't call them names. You don't say that they're stupid or whatever. That's something, because that's what Trump does all the time.
Yeah,
and we kind of make fun of it, but I think it actually has a real impact on the way people, again, perceive the system. And it is leading to a breakdown of the sort that you're describing here. At some point, because when that, the system sort of has a certain aura, okay, it's the system. This is what works. We all know there are limits to what we say. Trump doesn't observe those limits. And the aura of authority and kind of invincibility that the system has had up to this point begins to wane and eventually could disappear. And then we can have, it'll be commonplace to say, no, I'm not following that, because again, what can the court do? It was just that we have this previous understanding. Everybody, works according to these rules. But if you have certain people in power who don't, and they get away with it again and again, then the rules cease to have any meaning.
Yeah. Yeah. Scary. Okay, final question, Dad. For the Iran war, I heard Alexander Mercouris saying that if it was going to happen, it could either happen very soon, because it depends on the moon. When the moon's not around, then it's easier to do these, I guess you can't attack them so much on the stealth radar. I don't know if it's true, but if it doesn't happen like in the next 24 hours, then it would be around mid-March. Do you agree with that analysis, or?
Well, it might be true. I don't, again, I don't know. I heard him make that say, and it may be true. I just don't, I don't have anything to contribute to that. It makes sense up to a point. There's no question about that. It seems like it would, a new moon, a crescent moon would be to the advantage of the attacker. That's always been true in war. Is that, you don't want to attack during a full moon at night. That takes away, obviously makes you more visible to the defenders. But there are other things going on. One thing I think since after he made that statement, there was something that came out. It was reported, I believe it was in the Wall Street Journal, that Trump, was looking at the possibility of, some limited operation now to put extra pressure on the Iranians to agree to, to basically his demands, especially on the nuclear enrichment program. And he said that, well, if it doesn't work, though, he'll see what they do. And if they still refuse to capitulate, then somewhere later in the year, I think those are the exact words that were used, later in the year, he would launch an all-out attack. So, who knows? Again, it's just like we get all these leaks. Is that what they're really thinking? Or is that just part of, some sort of, deliberate, disinformation? But it may be true. Now,
but they can't do a limited strike, right? Once they do a limited strike, it's on.
Yeah, well, that's what the Iranians have been saying. They say, none of this limited strike game. It's not like, okay, you try to, decapitate our leader, and then we send some bombs against an airbase or missiles against a U.S. airbase, and then that's it. No, it says, like, if you attack us, we are attacking, and we will attack, we'll launch a full-scale attack. That's what the Iranians have been saying. They more than once, they've said it again and again and again. So if he thinks that that'll work, I don't think it will. I mean, but I think it shows something. It shows that, well, first of all, that I think he really does want a deal, and that he either talked himself into or was talked into it by somebody else. He say, well, the way to get a deal is to put this pressure on them. Right. You just send in, this huge armada, let them know that it's going to be, you're going to hit them with all you have if they don't agree. And then they'll agree. That's the art of the deal. It looks like that's what he's thinking, and it's not working. And we're getting statements from Witkoff, for example, is that the president is frustrated. He doesn't understand why the Iranians haven't capitulated. He thought they certainly would, and they're not doing it. They're not complying. They're not, they're not lying down or rolling over and showing their belly like a submissive dog. That's what they're supposed to do. They're not doing it, and he's frustrated. He's annoyed. And again, if this most recent report is correct, he's coming up with some cockamamie scheme of a limited strike, waiting again, and then an all-out strike.
It's insane. Yeah, and it's becoming clear now that Russia and China really are backing Iran, supporting them. There were joint naval exercises. China is able to provide Iran with real-time targeting data. This just changes the game completely. This is kind of like what the U.S. was like when it invaded Iraq. It had its target arrays, and it could just bomb, shoot its target to destroy the infrastructure. Iran is going to do this now. They can do that to us. They have real-time targeting on all of our bases, oil fields through the Middle East, whatever it is. They want to hit it, they can hit it. I can't believe this is happening. And I hate to say it, but I'm just, I'm ready for it, just because I'm ready for this whole house of cards to come tumbling down. This is just going to just destroy everything. And we can't live in this world like where we have one rogue country that has captured the United States that is doing all this insane. And we have this Epstein class that rules the West. This needs to end. And, I hate that it has to be a war that ends it, but it just seems like that's the only way. I don't see any other way. And maybe if we're lucky, it could slowly disappear over 20, 30 years as the new generation comes into power. But who knows? That they just gives them more time to potentially start some other war. I feel like,
yeah, right.
Kudos to
I don't
Iran.
think it's going to be. I mean, there are these important shifts that we're talking about, but I don't think it's going to be a 20 to 30 year process. There are going to be wars, even if this war doesn't actually happen, and then Trump somehow manages to, find an off ramp to this one. It doesn't look like he can, but just maybe he'll just create an off ramp and declare victory and whatever. That's always a possibility. Maybe we'll escape this war, but there will be, that like next year we're going to be in the same kind of position. It's just this constant pressure, and it's never going to end. And eventually we're going to have this war, unfortunately, against U.S. and Iran. So yeah, I don't want it to happen. I really don't. I really feel for the Iranian people. This is just so deeply unjust and cruel. But it looks like it has to happen. And it seems like they have resigned themselves to that fact. That's the thing. It's just like, okay, we just have to go through this. We're going to have to go through this. It's going to be, an ordeal by fire, but we need to accept that it will happen. We need to survive it. We need to come through on the other side. And
I will just say that, maybe this is a little solace to the people of Iran, but history will remember them in a favorable light. The Houthis, the Iranians is the one that said the buck stops here and ends this, defeated evil. And so I would say that is one thing to be proud of, that these nations, that stood up against the face of incredible power and evil.
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think that's an exaggeration.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we end it there. Anything else, Dad?
There are always things to talk about. There's things happening in Russia, but we can do it next time.
Okay, we'll do it next time. All right, if you made it to the end, please, like, comment, subscribe, and if you're able to subscribe and become join to become a member on YouTube, that'd mean a lot to me. It's only $2.99 a month. And also check out our Substack, all that good stuff, all linked below. All right, have a great rest of your day, Dad, and I'll talk to you soon.
Too.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.